Hello everyone, this is David again, and we are on Season 1, Episode 12, By Any Means Necessary. Now I do want to let everyone know that this episode, again, has touched me on a personal level, which JMS, J. Michael Straczynski, the executive producer, for those who maybe don't know, he tends to do a lot of that sort of thing, and I think that goes to the popularity of Babylon 5 and why people watch from the beginning to the end of the story arc is because JMS has this way of writing to the individual. And so this one again has touched me personally. It talks about basically the dock workers of Babylon 5. Now, what I'm getting at very shortly is that I was a registered nurse for 18 and a half years. The last 6 of those years, I was on the nurses union, and I did represented the nurses union at the negotiations for Providence Portland Medical Center in Northeast Portland. And I did that through 3 different contract talks. They had our contracts only lasted every 2 years. So I can relate to this top to bottom. So a lot of points you'll even see me, referring to things without notes, going like this. And because I just quite frankly know it because I lived it. Now, to get into a little bit of why don't I just go without notes. Number 1, I have a very poor memory. Number 2, I had a back injury, and I take a lot of happy pills, and so I forget things very easily. And I see some people who do that work without a script, and the problem is every 2 seconds, I am not kidding you, you see the skip where they had to stop and check their notes again because they forgot. I mean, really? Come on, people. Get yourself a damn script and stop skipping I've literally had one time, I think in 1 minute, this person skipped like 23 times. I mean, it was literally every other second, and I was just like, you know what, click off. So, that's why going down like this every once in a while, I hope it's not as distracting to you as that clicking stop motion. Please put in the comment section your opinion on that. If you would rather have me do that, I can try and do it. Or if you would rather just have me do what I'm doing and refer off of notes. Any sort of critiques like, dude, you take way too long per episode, or things like that. I think now I've done enough of these to get my confidence up. So if you think like, hey dude, these are too long or whatever, please put that in the notes or in your comments section. So anyway, starts off with the episode with perishable equipment for Jakar. The transport captain panics. You see that another transport is being erroneously up and loaded and going to head towards this guy. Ivanova is like, hey dude, don't move, stay in your transport, calm down, we'll get you tractored off to a different thing. But of course, this captain, seeing another ship coming right towards him, he panics and reacts. Moves his transport up. Unfortunately, it collides with the superstructure of Babylon 5 and explodes. Now, the captain's chamber evidently has some sort of shielding or something. The captain is alive, but one of the dock workers sadly dies. And so we go in and cue the intro, and it kind of quickly sets off the tone of, we're going to be talking about a lot of the dock workers and the people who make Babylon 5 run. And that's basically what this episode is about. Now, I do want to go into a little bit about private versus public sector unions. Now, this applies to the United States, if your country is different, please put that in the comments section. I'd really appreciate it. In the United States, we have what are public sector and what are private sector unions. Public sectors are like what your teachers' union is. And their job is to get the most money and the most benefits for their employees. On the other hand, you have private sector unions. That's what I was in. And our goal was to make sure that we had a job, that my employer, Providence Portland Medical Center, made a profit. Because as our head union negotiator, he was hired by the nurses union. He only worked for the nurses union. Now he's actually in the legislature in the state of Oregon, representing the Mount Tabor district. Little aside there. But basically he said, he's worked for private sector unions where the employer was not making money, i.e. going bankrupt, as we like to call it. And he said, it's not fun. So, two different things. The private sector unions are basically in line with management. We both have to make a profit, or we basically end up making a loss and going bankrupt. So, two different beasts entirely. If you work for a public sector union, please comment down into the summary section. I'd really appreciate your take on what I just said. So, cueing into the intro, and then it flashes over to Jakar is doing a religious ceremony. Natoth kind of brings her way in. Jakar quickly concludes, and turns out he's in his private quarters, goes on and answers the door. Evidently, something called a Jaquan Eth plant was destroyed. Now, it turns out there are a couple uses for Jaquan. The Narns use them for religious ceremony. They burn them as incense. However, when the Centauri had conquered Narn, they discovered that the seeds, when mixed with alcohol, can produce a mild hallucinogenic effect. And so that plays very prominently, as we'll see quickly. The employee, switching on over to the employee delegate, who was meeting with, I think, Sinclair, Jakar, and Ivanova. They go into a roundabout, and the employee delegate from the nurses unit, from the dock workers union, basically fights and says that their equipment is old, it's outdated, and there are not enough workers. Sure enough, Michael Garibaldi comes in with the official investigation, and it says that there are defective chips in the loader. Those defective chips blew out and ended up causing the whole thing, and that they're going to have to revamp a lot of their equipment because whoever got the contract used substandard chips because they managed, and then they lowballed their contract, and that's how they got it. And so now there's defective chips they know throughout the system, and you've got employee or dock workers who are working double and triple shifts. They have no turnaround time, and now all of a sudden they're going to have to completely revamp all of their dock equipment. And do it also without the pay raise that they were promised. And we'll come to that a little bit later. Turns around, flashes to Senator Hidoshi. He comes and calls in, and you'll see him a little bit later in some other episodes. The Senate's not going to increase the budget. Basically, you've all signed contracts with government employees. You can't go on strike, and so too bad. You're just going to have to eat it, basically. So, we flash on over into another scene. Natoth, Jakar's aide, goes out and finds out that one other person on Babylon 5 has a Jaquan Eth plant. Now, this Jaquan Eth is important to the Narns. In one particular ceremony, their sun goes up on the Jaquan mountain, and it hits the top at a particular time, and the head of their religious sect has to do this ceremony where he burns the Jaquan Eth seeds as incense while making prayers in Narnish, or he does it in English at first because, we don't speak Narnish, and they won't use subtitles, I guess. So, she finds out, though, that the captain of the ship that was bringing in the Jaquan Eth plant, of course, that ship was destroyed in the accident. However, one other being, she says, has it. And, of course, in Jakar's luck, who is that one being that has it? Londo Mollari, his sworn enemy. Oh, goody. I kind of covered a lot of this, so that's why you'll see me flashing down on my notes. As they were talking about can't quit and can't go on strike, I remember one of the worst nursing manager I've ever seen in 18 and a half years. This woman was a tyrant. She first started off as an instructor, which she's good at. She is extremely good at. Never, ever, ever give this woman authority over people, though. Oh my God, she was horrible. Literally. On one of the nurses' unions, when they, or units, next to ours, when they had her as their interim manager, she was so bad. And of course, you can't go on strike because you have this big contract. Well, the nurses on the other units aren't going to go on strike just because one unit has a bad manager. So what did these poor people do? Well, all of the nurses on night shift for 3 days in a row called in sick. Now that's called a blue flu, okay? And it is technically illegal, but they did it. How are you going to stop it? Well, our hospital got the clue, and they basically took this temporary manager, moved her over to our unit as the instructor, and they found a permanent replacement for her. Okay, you would have thought the first time that they learned their lesson, but oh no, they put her in charge of our unit, and I have never. There were several times if if I wasn't such good friends with some of the nurses on that unit, there were days where literally I was ready to take my name badge, throw it at her, and say, F you, I'm out of here. Literally, it was that bad. And I've had some bad. I worked in a nursing home for 3.5 years. My God, you want to talk about horrible. Just a tyrant. Well, a lot of people, one of my friends was written up for disciplinary action because he couldn't do his blood gas testing, his recertification for it. Why couldn't he do it? Because he fell down the damn stairway because whoever mopped it didn't put up a wet floor sign. He fell down the stairway and broke his leg, and he was in the hospital getting his leg fixed, and that's why he couldn't take this one test, and that's why she put him on a 90-day suspension because he broke his damn leg. Oh, God. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you to death with this because I could go on for hours, but they eventually got rid of her and got the best nurse manager I ever had, thank God, right after him. Leslie, our nurse manager, was just an angel. So, back to the Babylon 5 universe. They are talking about something called a Rush Act, probably something they can invoke to bust unions. We have a lot of those types of laws where nurses' unions can't just all of a sudden vote tomorrow to go on strike. It is an incredibly long process. And I'll tell you a couple of things. Number one, even if you get nurses to strike, which would be a Herculean effort, most of them will They don't save any money when they're told we're going to be going on strike. Even in, like, we had one hospital go in where they were saying for over a year and a half, we're going to go on strike, you got to save up, and they won't. People live paycheck to paycheck. My job as what the secretary was to go around and whip up people's support for this. And a lot of the nurses were saying, David, I'm sorry, but I live paycheck to paycheck. And we just say it out front, I can't afford to go on strike. Now, before a lot of you are saying, well, these are just greedy unions anyway, when we were talking about going on strike once, we were asking for a 4 and a 4.5% pay raise. And the Lund Report, which is one of those groups that likes to dig up the dirt on hospitals and healthcare systems and then publish it, they published that our CEO during this time got a 66% and a 38% pay raise in the same time period. So, before you accuse unions of being greedy, that's what we're up against. Some of it, I think, like the union that represented Twinkies, they were in line to get like a $1,500 payoff or something like that if Twinkies went belly up and went bankrupt. And then like their CEO was slated at the same time to get like a $14 million golden parachute. So before you accuse unions of just being greedy, understand the CEOs, the top 1%, that top of that pyramid, they have it so stacked against you, it's unreal. At least that's the United States. If your system is completely different, say in France or Japan or Russia, please put that down, in the comments below. Going on back, we see a little bit of a negotiation. Londo was trying to key himself in, but noticed his doors open, and he goes in there, and who's sitting in there? Jakar. Now, Jakar obviously helped himself in and was rustling about looking for Londo's Jaquan Eth plant and didn't find it because Londo was expecting it and he hid the plant somewhere safe, he said. So Londo was demanding 50,000 commercial credits, to which Jakar jumped up, screamed, that's outrageous. And Londo basically said, look, you invaded Ragash 3 and personally humiliated my nephew. Did you think I was going to forget that? So if you see a memo about 50,000 commercial credits, that's where it comes from. Flashing on over to the Labor Committee of the Senate decides to send a guy named Oronzento. And a couple of times I know our union would get at an impasse and they would just send a negotiator from the local labor relations board. And depending on who is the president or the governor and whoever assigns, the arbitrators and stuff like that, depending on, will highly influence on whether you can go on strike or whether you can get a decent contract or not. So, I can relate to that quite well. As flashing on over, Londo later on changes his mind and says he's not going to sell it for any price. Jumping on down we go to Jakar's quarters and he discusses religion with Nataf. So, and I'm not going to go through that. I'm sure if you please go through and watch it if you haven't seen it. A little bit of interesting you find out about Jakar's religious beliefs. Now, during this time you see Jakar, he kind of pays passive attention to his religion. You'll see later on in the series, it tends to now consume more and more of his time. And you'll see very much later in the series, Jakar ends up himself becoming a major religious figure to the Narn people, much to his chagrin. While this is going on, evidently the workers officially declare themselves having a strike, which is, it's an illegal strike. If they're under contract, it's illegal. A lot of the nurses, when I talked about earlier, that one terrible nurse manager and all the nurses on night shift on one of our sister units went on strike, they technically could have gotten into a lot of trouble. But Providence, like every other hospital in this country, is working with a shortage of nurses. So, as we've seen with the pandemic too, when the nurses finally have had enough, they can just get up and walk out, and you were up, pardon my language, shit creek without a paddle. Especially if you're there on a respirator. And I can tell you, having been into contracts and into, coming somewhat close to getting, having to go on strike, it's very seldom about the pay. Okay, at least for nurses, it's very seldom about the pay. Most of the time, it's about staffing issues, about getting us more nurses to help. So, anyway, jumping back to Babylon 5. Sinclair personally is trying to plead with Malari to give Jakar the plant. And Malari says, "I'd do anything for you, but just not this one thing. I'm enjoying sticking it to Jakar. Too bad, not going to give it to him." Zip on over. A guy named Lorenzento goes in. He tries to negotiate from the Senate Labor Committee. He is rebuffed. He ends up invoking what's called the Rush Act. And he has to go to the Senate to get approval for this Rush Act. So, during another scene, we go to the bridge. Londo and Jakar end up having a major row. Then some lady from the Interstellar News Network on the station comes in, and I can't remember who else comes in, but they're all literally screaming at the top of the back and forth, and finally Sinclair's had enough on his last good nerve, and he basically says, "Ivanova, in 10 seconds I want you to clear this bridge." And all of a sudden we see Ivanova counting 10, 9, and getting into everyone's face and doing her Ivanova, get the hell out of my way kind of a thing. And you'll see Ivanova just has that way of imposing her will on anybody. And she starts counting 10, 9, 8, and of course gets down to about 3. They've already cleared the station. As it would happen, Michael Garibaldi walks on and he says 3, 2, 1. So what I miss, everybody? Now, I'm sure you're saying, why did you mention that? Heavily memmed, so pay attention to that scene. You'll see a lot of mems on it. He gets a call from Senator Hidoshi. The Senate has invoked the Rush Act. Maybe some of the senators are hoping for violence. Basically, they want to impose their will, and they're going to use Babylon 5 to set a precedent. So Sinclair says, "I want to see the full text of this order." And so he starts to do that, and we switch scenes to a fight breaking out between securities and the workers. And security under Garibaldi, eventually their plan is to pump in morph gas and arrest him while asleep. Now, morphine gas is a dubious thing. There was an episode where a terrorist group attacked a Russian opera house, I believe. And they were going to bomb everything, and so the Russian police ended up, or the military, I can't remember, ends up pumping in their equivalent of morph gas. The problem is these troops weren't properly trained right, and if you're laying on your back, and sometimes it causes people to throw up, and you're laying on your back after being dragged out of this theater, and you throw up, and nobody turns you over on your side, you'll get what we call aspiration, and you can choke to death. And sure enough, unfortunately, half of the casualties from this terrorist attack was from incidentally, a reaction to this gas. So, The Rush Act gives Sinclair the authority to do whatever he wants, basically, to end the strike. So he says, I am going to use my authority from the Senate to reallocate 1.3 million credits from the military budget for equipment and more wages. And yay! So all the workers are yay! And he says, I'm going to give a general amnesty to anyone who has committed no other crimes. So the fight that had broken out earlier between security and the workers, they just let bygones be bygones and call it a fair fight. And Sinclair turns to this Oronzento guy and says, heavily memmed, so I'm going to share it with you, never hand someone a gun unless you're sure where they will point it. So, it starts to, as they're trying to wind down, we have to flash over, and Sinclair talks to Jakar and says, Londo ends up giving Jakar the Jaquan F plant. And Sinclair has a little talk with Jakar, and Jakar says, oh, you're a far more religious man than I give you credit for. Sinclair says that I know a couple of Jesuit priests in high school who would disagree with you. The reason why I mention it, because in real life, Michael O'Hare, the actor, did go to Catholic high school. So, it ends on a happy note. Jakar does his ceremony and burns the incense and says his prayers, and a bunch of other Narns are there all of a sudden, and they say their prayers, and we cue off to the closing credits. So, having been or worked with a nurses union, I got to see a lot of the financial information about the hospital, this private Catholic charity hospital that was swimming in money. Okay, I can tell you that for certain. And they always presented it like, we bequeath unto you this, and a lot of the nurses would just lap it up thinking, oh, they're just giving us all this stuff, while I'm sitting here like, no, we're having to point a gun at their heads to even give us a 3 and a 3.5% pay raise. Meanwhile, their CEO is getting 68 and I think 36% pay raise. And, anyway, I after 6 years of that, it was like one nurse said, I learned too much. Probably if I wouldn't have popped out my back, I probably would have done 1 or 2 more contract talks and then resigned and let somebody else take over. But anyway, if any of you have any experiences with unions that are different, please put that in the comments section. I'd really, really love to hear from you. Anyways, hope you all have a good rest of your day. As always, comment, like, subscribe, and share. Hope you all have a good rest of your day.